Wow, this is super exciting. This is the first time I have been with OCLC and at an ALA, and I wasn't quite sure what the turnout was going to be this morning, and this is amazing. It is so great to see all of you this morning for Transforming Metadata. So my name is Richard Urban. I am a senior program officer with the Research Library Partnership, which is part of the larger OCLC Research. OCLC Research accelerates and scales learning, innovation, and collaboration to advance libraries and librarianship. At this QR code URL, you'll find a recent post from Rachel Frick talking a little bit about what the Research Library Partnership does and what we've been doing in the last couple of years. In part, again, we're inspiring research. We've been holding spaces for reparative metadata description and also trying to find ways that we can take action. I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers this morning. So first we have Heather Mollison-Sandy, and we're actually going to go, and I have these slides out of order. So Ink Young is going to go first, but then we're going to get to Dr. Mollison-Sandy, who has a primary research interest on organization and access to information, including the field of scholarly communication through technology. She holds a doctorate in LIS and from Rutgers University, and also a master's in library and information science and an MA in French, which we were talking about beforehand. Lots of interesting combinations there, from the University of Illinois. And our second speaker is Ink-Young Choi. I'm very happy to welcome Ink-Young. She is also part of the OCLC research activities as an associate research scientist. Ink-Young received her MLIS from Syracuse University and a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She served as a teaching assistant, professor, and taught metadata, linked data, information modeling, information organization at the University of Illinois. And she currently serves on the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative Education Committee and actively engages with the members of the metadata community worldwide. Her research interests are knowledge organization, metadata, ontology, and linked data.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. First of all, really, I appreciate coming to this session this early morning. Well, thank you, Richard, for that great introduction. I'm relatively new at the OCLC. My research previously, before I joined OCLC, I did research on the Dewey Decimal Classification, in general knowledge organization system, looking at the social cultural influences in the classificatory structure. And then that leads me to this current, research agenda at the OCLC. So today, I just want to talk about how we support global perspective or multiple viewpoint through this modeling practice. So that's what I am talking about today. So modeling intercultural work in ontology design. So I mainly focus on what the intercultural work is, which was my previous study focused on, then how we can model that in ontology design. This is still very in the early stage of the research. So that's why I wanted to share this with everyone so that I can get really great input or feedback from you. Maybe some of you are very familiar with ontology and war and things like that, but some of you may not familiar with that. So I'll start with the background. What is ontology? Why we do this modeling things? And then I'll talk about some problem I found, especially when the ontology, or in general, like knowledge organizer system, when that system is localized, there are some challenges. So I'll talk about that. And then that's where I introduce this notion of intercultural warrant. And then lastly, I will talk about some suggestion how we model this notion of intercultural warrant in the ontology design. That's going to be my future research agenda. So then why we do this modeling? Well, when we say modeling, that sounds fancy, but actually it's just to understand what domain we are dealing with is really, right? So good example of information modeling is this WEMI. How many of you sounds familiar with WEMI, right? Yeah, I know we are librarians. So even though you're not working in the metadata field, like I believe from the metadata, from the library school, you heard of this WEMI thing. So work expression manifestation item, this is capturing, like a bibliographic universe, right? So based on this modeling, now we produce record that can actually navigate through these entities. So that's just example. That's what the modeling does, especially for bibliographic document and a record. Then why we work with ontology and then what is ontology? Ontology is very versatile actually. Ontology can be one of a control vocabulary. It can be one of a knowledge organizer system, but at the same time, it also supports data model. So using ontology, we capture what this domain is about, how things are connected to each other, and then we can produce or generate the data based on that. So that's why ontology these days become a thing. A example, this is ontology that are designed particularly for knowledge organization system, the simple knowledge organization system. So this ontology support describing and representing knowledge organization systems such as subject heading and the classification and sisters and extra. So we can define the concept, we can make or express relationship, like equivalent relationship, like what is preferred term, alternative term. We can also express a hierarchical relationship and much more with this discuss. So using this ontology, what I want to do is model the intercultural warrant. That what is intercultural warrant? This is the for my doctoral study, I studied the Dewey Decimal Classification when it is localized into the Korean Decimal Classification. Dewey, like universal classification system like a Dewey actually used across the country, across the culture and languages, and then Korean Decimal Classification is one of that. What I wanted to discover is, we recognize that there are plural social cultural views out there. So, previously we consider a classification is like a universal thing, but now we know that there are multiple, like system fit with multiple community. But we needed to look at how this multiple or plural social cultural view interplays in the system, right? So understanding of this interplay will support the ethical warrant, which is to take actions protecting the suppressed. So when we have a plural cultural view in a one system, it's what can happen is one big cultural hegemony actually dominate everything else. So we need to understand how this multiple plural view actually interplays in a system. So that's what these intercultural warrants suggest to investigate. So one of the findings from my previous study is that there are some disciplines and domains that are much more consensual, and then there are other discipline and domain can be much more culturally dependent. So for example, when I investigated Dewey, the social science classes had to go through more adaptation when it is localized into Korean Decimal Classification because of that social culture differences. But in the technology class, there were, just the classes, some sort of assimilating, Dewey, which has no differences. So we recognize that, not every statements are equal. Some statements are more culturally dependent than the others. And this distinction is actually not new. There has been a discussion about this, like more like a universal and viewpoint dependent. This also can explain the scientific statement. In a science knowledge organization or scholarly communication, there are more consensus statements which is already proved by like long history of the scientific research, but there are some controversial statements that are not yet fully proved, right? So we recognize that there are some degree of the consensus depending on what discipline or domain we're dealing with. So that's where this concept of validity scope comes in play. I borrowed this concept from this article published in 2018. So basically, this support that idea of cultural warrant and intercultural warrant. There are multiple plural viewpoints out there that can fit a certain statement. So we recognize that some statement can be more, viewpoint dependent. So we wanted to annotate that specific viewpoint. So if you look at this model, this is Open Knowledge Organization Network model. So there are a statement set and a viewpoint set. Here the S is the statement set. So we can make a statement, but it doesn't mean that all statements are equally consensual, right? So we want to have a separate validity scope that can support this specific statement. So looking at this RDF, if you're familiar with it, it'll be really easily readable. If you're not familiar with this one, just let me explain that. So see here, we can use this validity scope as a class, and then we can actually enter the specific situation or context. It can be a language, it can be a geographic location, it can be a certain historical era. So we need to work on this like in multiple category that actually validating a certain statement. So that by having this validity scope attached to the certain statement, now we are officially claiming that this statement only valid in this particular context. So now, getting back to Dewey Decimal Classification, this is some of the issues the Dewey Decimal Classification has been famous for. Yeah, and then this is like what the OCLC also identified as a like issue of the Dewey Decimal Classifications. There are some issue with the names of groups of people. And the Western biases and Christian biases that are more structural, right? So, well, how do we express these biased languages if we annotate the particular viewpoint in the system? Like user will understand, oh, this is particularly from the specific context. So this doesn't claim that it's universal or it's contemporary, right? So we can understand this context behind concept or languages. So these are some of the efforts from Dewey Decimal Classification Editorial Committee. Well, these are some recent topics that the committee has been working on. Like immigration, climate change, and then gender dysphoria. These were the topic that I think from the most recent committee meetings, they've been working on changing this particular sort of biased language and structure in the Dewey Decimal Classification. But what I suggest here, we need to keep doing this editorial work because we don't want to see some biased language in the system. But at the same time, instead of just getting the system fixed as time goes by, we also need to annotate, this contextual information so that we can keep, where this was from, and then that can be also our data or our data to understand the history and then context and then this knowledge that we have been building. I talk about this validated scope. That the thing is, the challenge with this validated scope is we need to come up with a good validity, right? I mean, what's the good context that we can validating these particular statement. So that's our job if we get to use this model. So here, this is the roadmap to figure out those contexts that need to be annotated as a viewpoint for viewpoint scope. So first of all, we need to identify potential category for viewpoint annotation. So where this viewpoint annotation is needed, right? These are very rough categories that we come up with so far. Translation. Dewey has been used across the country and the languages, and then there are good translated classes and languages, but there are also some unmatched translation because of the nature of the languages, right? So maybe we can also annotate that part when the language is not one-to-one match. And then there are also culture category, either historical, social references, so we can use the particular time period, we can use particular geographic location, and then this is something we need to also come up with. And then also controversial category that will explain this particularly for the scientific research, what has been proved already and then what are still in the test or in the discussion. So that can be also annotated so that people can have correct information, not false information. And then the last one is pretty much consensual, which is scientifically proved and socially accepted in the certain community. So we can also use that as one of the category. So we'll start with this very broad draft category, and then what we need to identify is subcategory of these so that we can annotate the particular viewpoint. So I'm going to do the domain analysis because, I now test this possibility of the validated scope, especially for the Dewey Decimal Classification. I definitely need to talk to the people, who work with the Dewey Decimal Classification. So I will do the document analysis of the cataloging and the indexing policies to understand how the Dewey is really used in the cataloging scene, and also interview with the DC editorial board and community members so that, again, I can acknowledge and understand what are some problematic issues in the Dewey. And the third step is going to be test those identified category through the data. So we need to look at the WorkCat data, the market data particularly, and then maybe we can also extract particularly a note field and subject accesses, and then investigate what are some common patterns that can be annotated as a viewpoint. And then another data we can look is the Dewey Authority data, which contain many information like where this term is from, like a source data, and then some other heading like linking to the Dewey Decimal Classification that can also explain, how this Dewey classes or particular, number is used in cataloging. The fourth step is going to design ontology. Well, a Dewey potentially can be described in a scope because it's a knowledge organization system, but we need to have this separate ontology, understand viewpoint, and then insert this into the Dewey in a SCOOS or some other linked data system, so that what we can do with this implementation. Here are some use cases. The first use case is either user or cataloger can make informed decision because they now see what viewpoint this statement was from. For example, like statements such as this concept has a preferred label, say lake or the river, like that particular statement about the naming is from only United States, not necessarily from Australia, right? So then we can see, where this terminology comes from, and then we can also see where the structural decision will come from. Like for example, come up with the good example. The example from the Korean decimal classification. In the Korean decimal classification, management class is in the social science, but in the Dewey, management is in the technology, because it's sort of technology to govern the things. But so these things are viewed differently across the culture. So where that structure, where this hierarchical relationship come from, that can be also annotated, and then you can see that contextual information through this implementation. And the second use case, this is actually what I am mostly excited about. It allows the data analysis. So you can actually search the vocabulary or the statement in the Dewey that are in a particular viewpoint. And in the near future, when the Dewey is connected to other vocabulary, we can actually search like concept or language across the vocabulary using this particular viewpoint. It will be a very interesting data analytic technique. So the implication of this particular plane, so it provides systematic support beyond just fixing outdated language and classification structure. And it allows, as I told you, data analysis of the bibliographic data in regard to particular context-based issues. And it also supports, eventually, although this particular research plan is limited to the Dewey Decimal Classification, but if we expand this to, like more vocabulary than Dewey, it will support the progress of the science by realizing the interdisciplinarity. Okay, so these are some questions unanswered yet. Like these are more like questions for actual implementation, like where to start, and then who does this annotation, and then how are we going to use crowdsourcing? Are we going to use domain expert to annotate this viewpoint? So these are some unanswered questions, and then that's where I love to hear your opinions. So thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. So we're switching gears a little bit, still staying with the topic of transforming metadata, but I really wanted to look at this problem, whereas In-Kyung just presented you with a kind of solution. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I wanted to delve a little more deeply into the problem. And I didn't want to frame this so much as a research presentation. Rather, I wanted to sort of look at this as a smorgasbord of food for thought for you this morning at 9:30 a.m. You might not be hungry yet, but let's see what we can do. So with this presentation, as you can see, I wanted to focus on the work of my lab, the Inclusive Catalog Use Lab. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as I go. And the work that we're doing looking at Q+ users of library catalogs. So to set the stage a little bit, it is amazing the work that the cataloging community has been doing. And I mean, really, for generations of catalogers, we've been focused on the problems related to social justice and the usability of catalogs. easily I can go back to the work of Sandy Berman in the 1970s, trying to figure out how best to create subject access that wouldn't alienate our users. So we've really inherited a long line of thinkers and their approaches to this topic, and yet there's still much that we do not know. For example, one of the problems that my group and I identified is, as good as we are, and I know we're good, we don't always reach out directly to the communities with whom we're trying to work. And that can be problematic. I think I can explain to you what I mean in just a moment, so maybe suspension of disbelief of where I'm going with this. So some of the problems, and these I'm presenting them as they relate to the LGBTQ plus community, but really you could extrapolate these, I think, to a lot of other marginalized groups, and I hope you will as relevant. So the problem of literary warrant. Now, I teach organization of information at an iSchool, so I am very used to blank stares when I say literary warrant. Do you folks know what I'm talking about? Okay, very good. Not everyone is nodding. Okay, very quickly, a quick and dirty explanation of what I mean by this. It's elegant, I mean truly, it is elegant to devise the words that you use to describe a collection from the words in the collection itself. That is, it is elegant, and in many ways, it removes the bias of the person who is creating this controlled vocabulary. So in the case of the Library of Congress, subject headings, the collection upon which those terms are based is the Library of Congress collection. The problem with that is the people who write for and publish works that are included in the Library of Congress, well, those are people with PhD degrees, who are specialists, who don't speak like normal people. So we end up with this problem where highly educated people have really nice, elegant access to these resources, but sort of average people whom we very much want to serve, and especially folks who are members of marginalized communities and have their own ways of speaking, are going to be doubly unable to intuitively at least access these materials using verbal subject access or controlled vocabularies. Point number 2, with the LGBT plus community, this community, like many other communities, is incredibly diverse, and I'll dig into this in just a minute. So moving on to point number 3, there are some phenomenal systems available to help members of marginalized communities access library materials. And I just want to absolutely give a shout out to the Homosaurus, the folks who are creating it. It is an amazing resource. If you're unfamiliar with it, I do recommend that you take a good long look at it. It is highly, it's a high quality controlled vocabulary designed by and for members of the LGBT plus Q community. So lots of great work being done. The problem is we still don't necessarily know how folks who are not librarians, for example, are going to be searching for materials in catalogs. And this is really the question that my group wanted to look into. As I said, this is not a research presentation. I have loads of papers I can point you to, lots of other talks. But I just wanted to kind of, again, give you some food for thought as we go through this as to some of the things that we can think about when we think about transforming metadata. The group that I keep referring to, this is my inclusive cataloging use lab, the ICU lab, and we all kind of joke about the creepy eyeball, but the idea is that I see you, you unseen user of the catalog, and we're trying to work with and make sense of the way these folks are approaching catalog use. So one question that we might ask is, how straightforward is LGBTQ plus identity? I think I hear somebody laughing already. Good. That's the spirit. And of course, given the group that I have assembled here in front of me, you know that where we're going with this is trying to think about not only identity, but terminology that one might use to talk about identity. So this was part of a much bigger project, and in fact, we were only using this survey to recruit for an in-depth interview. And I'll just be clear, there was $50 on the line. Folks were going to receive $50 if we chose them for an interview. So we had a load of interest in this. We advertised it on Goodreads, on Facebook, on some subreddits devoted to LGBTQ plus reading. And a lot of librarians very helpfully picked it up and retweeted it or reposted it. But we were not actually wanting to find what librarians thought, but that's okay. It was very well intentioned, and we were glad for the shout outs. We ended up wanting only, however, to work with adults, so 18 years old or older, members of the LGBTQ plus community. For reasons of language, as you may imagine, we were hoping to stick with people who were very good with English language. Just that was one of the limitations, so we limited it to the US. That was just what we did. And again, we wanted to focus on folks who knew how to use a library catalog. We didn't need to work with people who were successful. We just needed people who admitted that they used a library catalog. So we ended up with 141 results. And one of these questions that we asked folks about themselves it was a fill in the blank line, no prompts, no nothing. Talk about your LGBTQ plus identity. And the people who responded, just to be very clear, there were all different age ranges, education levels, ethnicities. I mean, just a wide range. We were very pleased, and a huge number of data points of terms that were provided that described LGBTQ plus identity. To the point that my brilliant colleague, Brian Dabrowski, I don't know if you know him, he's at the University of Texas, said, we are stuck. We have no idea how to deal with this. I have an idea. Why don't we use the facets associated with the gender unicorn? And if you've done any kind of diversity training at your institution, you may be familiar with this. If not, it's a really neat resource that was put up by the Trans Student Union, I believe. I don't have my glasses on, I'm sorry. It's on the slide. Really interesting work that's been talked about a lot, I think. So he used this, and he worked with some students to analyze the results. And to be clear, there weren't quite enough facets available with the 5 that were offered from the unicorn. So he added 2 more just to address every single response that we received. So to be clear, not everyone in the 141 responses provided information that addressed each facet. Some only addressed one facet, some addressed more than one facet. Again, getting at the complexity. That's really all I'm trying to drive home with this. So this is, I understand, completely unreadable, but let's zero in, perhaps that's a little better. The top 3 results in terms of gender identity, that facet, a lot of the responses, especially those who gave this information, was either male, female, or non-binary. All right. But then there was sort of this middle range of responses, if you will, where anywhere from 4 to 2 people indicated these responses. And then there was this long tail of folks who, there was only one response that said this. And I do want to be clear, when we looked at these responses, you know, I know as kind of catalogers, we all have this, possibly some of us anyway, I don't want to speak for you, but have this like, oh, I'm just going to lump together the ones that are similar. But identity is really personal. And we thought that every single character that was included was intentional. So we left them exactly as we received them. And this is what we ended up with, this huge long tail of gender identity. That was by far the facet where folks gave us the most information about themselves. The gender modality facet, though, also had a lot of responses, as you can see. And this also was sort of a long tail, if you will, of responses, not so many clustered at the top there. With gender alignment and then gender expression, there was only one response for each of these facets. Okay, again, it wasn't required, it was just what people chose to provide about themselves. Fair enough. The physical attraction facet, folks tended to mention this quite a bit. Again, clustered at the top, and I didn't break this out for you. Gay, lesbian, or bisexual. But then another string of responses, each of which, many of which were unique. And then the emotional attraction facet, there was one response that addressed this, homoromantic. Long story short, this was a lot of terms. And when we think about this, so the answer to that initial question that I posed here, is LGBTQ plus terminology straightforward? No, it's not. So the next question I have for you, as Ink Young left with a bunch of questions for you, my question to you is, how do we acknowledge all of these different facets? How do we identify these different identities and acknowledge them? And how do we do that respectfully if the folks who have these identities don't necessarily agree on the best way to express them? It's truly a challenge for how best to provide information about something as, air quotes, simple or straightforward as identity among members of a same community. So the next question I have, and I this is just really food for thought at this point. In the meantime, so we've got the Homosaurus, as I mentioned, and there is a lot of amazing work being done porting, using the crosswalk, terms from the Homosaurus into library catalogs. I will mention, and I am happy to be wrong. In fact, I really hope I am wrong. But a lot of the times what I've been seeing is those crosswalks are going to bring in identical terms. It's not that the work has been reanalyzed and different terminology has been brought in. It's really that the crosswalk is bringing in the exact same term from the Homosaurus. I hope you have examples of work that's being done that goes beyond that. So it's a great start. Again, please don't get me wrong. It's an amazing start, and that's where I'm going with this. But there's probably a fair bit more that we could do to address the best ways to provide access to members of marginalized communities. And I will say, I spent all day yesterday at the Newberry working with a group of librarians who do area studies. So they do non-English language resources and cataloging. And they were doing different round tables, like literally at tables. They were doing that speed dating thing where you go to different tables and talk. And I analyzed the results for them of the whiteboard where you write down everything that the table comes up with. And at the metadata/cataloging table, they asked, I thought, a poignant question. And it was, do we really need LCSH at this point? Because it's really not helping. It's with a lot of the resources that they have, either the LCSH doesn't make sense, it's insulting, it's alienating, it's, so they did make remarks about the progress that's being made, but I was proud of them because they didn't leave anything off the table. So asking these really hard questions, because, we all get so used to, well, this is the system we have, maybe we should try to fix it, but it was interesting that it was folks outside of cataloging who posed the question. So the one final bit of food for thought that I have for you is I've been doing a lot of thinking. We were talking about, I just mentioned I was working with language studies librarians yesterday, area studies, and Richard and I were talking about the experiences I had as an English language learner of French. French was my second language. And there was this phenomenon that's known as code switching that we would talk about. So, as a language learner. So if you have learned a second language, you didn't grow up in a bilingual society, you actually went to classes and tried to memorize vocabulary lists. And say you got to the point where you went and tried to have a conversation with somebody. You were so proud of yourself. You're finally at this middle level of knowing the language that you can get out a sentence or two pretty solidly. And you get halfway through your sentence and you realize you don't know the word that you're trying to say. And you pause and you stumble and you struggle, and then you just spit it out in your native language. So you just say, oh, I went to the bank. You just say it in English, right? So that is code switching. There are other reasons that people code switch. So moving from one language to another. It can be intentional, it can be unintentional. If you are bilingual, you might realize that there are some words that have slightly different meanings in one language and another, and you might choose to use one word. Kind of the same way we acknowledge that our folks who are mentioning information about their identity were very specifically, in our estimation, choosing one way of phrasing information about their identity, choosing that over another. So when we've got this complex situation with language in our head, and already we're asking people to translate that into, in the case of querying a library catalog, Library of Congress subject headings. But somebody who is a member of a marginalized community who, for example, is trying to search something related to LGBTQ plus identity, we're asking that person to go another step further, to transition through yet another code in order to get to what we have used to describe that book, using that literary warrant-based, but possibly improved, hopefully, right, approach that we have available to us. And this is really a lot to ask of folks. So, that leaves us with the idea that if we're talking about transforming metadata, we really need to be focusing on the users. It's so interesting, we're all up to our elbows in systems and metadata, but we always have to take that step back. And I implore you, I know you're all doing it. I know you all know Cutter's, the convenience of the cataloger is second only to the convenience of the user, however that goes. Sorry, I completely mangled that. That's the idea being that we have to look at our users as we go and not only be thinking about the systems and their affordances. So the big questions, how can we do this? How can we promote social justice in the cataloging that we do, given all of these complexities of language, of identity, just as a tip of the iceberg that I present to you? And how can we do this? Clearly, it's not in a vacuum. We only have limited hours in the day, and there are only limited numbers of us doing this work. So how do we make this happen? So yeah, I don't have the answers to those. I put those to you. I definitely, though, want to acknowledge my team members. I mentioned Brian Dobretsky before and Karen Snow of Dominican, who is around. If you see her, you can talk to her about this. I invite you to. And then the students with whom we've worked. So thank you. I look forward to your thoughts on this.
Well, we are at time, so thank you all for coming. If you are interested in other work that's going on in the OCLC Research Library Partnership, we have a number of new reports sustaining the collective art collection, the NAFAN, National Finding Aid Project, as well as information on research and information management. So please stop by. Thank you.